I literally was like winging it. Like I did.
I briefly worked by investment and I got Star Wars. I have all the love in Georgia. The Shadow.
I think 0 times.
I tested the bond today a little bit, but she's
She's having a bunch on it.
Is she already? They're not all necessarily rally or teas, but I mean, they're part of rally. I'm not sure I was. And I suggested you guys would love more content. Make more coaches for Sire. And it's this beautiful little town of more coaches down at the lake, kind of the bottom end of these go to one, walk up the hill. It's a beautiful thing to do. And she's just going to be
That's what I thought too. I was just gonna like have to
Well, I told them I was seeing that. Expected Okay, folks, we'll get started. Is anyone aware of anyone who is on their way and is not down here with us yet? No, not necessarily. Can you all hear me well enough? Yes. Yes. Great. Yeah. Well, it's a great pleasure of mine to. Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure of mine to welcome back George Saumarez Smith. This is the third time that George is doing this with us as a workshop. And I had the pleasure of meeting George in 2008 at a conference in New York organized by the ICAA on Palladio and his urban dimension. There's often forgotten, much underappreciated urban dimension of Palladio's work. And then not long after that, George was part of a viral video that went around with Ben Pendry and Francis Terry, where you may have seen this, them drawing very fast, although not as fast as they actually drew in reality, but faster, let's say faster than reality, but of them working out a large-scale illusionistic perspective drawing of an ordered system. And drawing is very much part of George's identity, about which he's going to tell you a lot, more than I should or will. But it made me think of when I was in Philadelphia. Somebody described a young architect at another office in Philadelphia as the hot pencil over at a particular firm, and George is certainly the hot pencil at Robert Adam. He qualified as an architect in 1998 after having graduated from Winchester College at Edinburgh University, and with a first-class degree and a diploma with distinction in architecture. So he qualified as an architect in 1998, joined Adam Architecture in 2003, and became a director in 2004. Am I right? The youngest director? Yeah. Yep. And the youngest director ever. See, I know George. George regularly teaches, lectures, and writes on a wide range of subjects relating to traditional architecture. He's received various awards for his work and was one of 6 shortlisted architects for the 2011 Young Architect of the Year Award. This is a fabulous part of George's biography that I love reading because it harkens back to another world in a way. He is an elected brother of the Art Workers Guild and chairman of the Art Workers Guild, chairman of the trustees from 2009 to 14. He's a member of the Georgian Group, an elected member of INTBAU and the College of Traditional Practitioners, and he's a freeman of the Worshipful Company of Chartered Architects. These are all fabulous guild ideas that we have so much lost in the world, and God bless them that they're still there in England. He was one of 3 classicists whose work was featured in an exhibition at the Royal Institute of British Architects, the RIBA, in 2010. He's the author of a treatise on modern architecture from Barbara Press, and his design for a 33 New Bond Street, London, was featured in the Classicist number 11. The show of his work, Measure, Draw, Build, is at the RIBA through this month until the 28th, I think, of November. If anybody is thinking about traveling to London over the Thanksgiving break, that would be a fabulous thing to do while you're there. It's great to see historical things. It's even better to realize that there are people like George who are alive today doing what he's doing and building wonderful things that measure up to the best that we know of the past. So it's a great pleasure to welcome George and allow him to talk to us for tonight, and we'll also be spending tomorrow with him at the Village Pool.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Can you all hear me all right? Yeah. And I think rather scarily, this is being recorded, even broadcast back in South Bend. And so anyway, hello to anybody who's in South Bend as well. So I thought I would talk about the Romance of Classicism, and then I want to say a bit about the orders, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my work as well. Yeah, the theme is this curious phrase, the Romance of Classicism, which is actually not something you hear very often, because Romanticism and Classicism are normally described as opposites to one another. Of course, the Romantic movement is, with capital R, is something that happens in the 19th century, is very much led by a sort of glorification of the past, an interest in ruins. It comes in the form of poetry and music as well as in architecture. And it's almost seen as a counterpoint to a very rigorous and academic form of classicism. So you get Romanticism and Classicism being seen as almost as opposites to one another. But my view is that they perhaps ought to be seen as two sides of the same coin, at the very least. And that very often we're dealing with things that are both romantic and classical. And of course, because we're in Rome, I think of it as a city which is, of course, in many ways, the foundation of so much that's classical, but it is also a very romantic city. And it's a city that the Romantic poets came to be inspired by the ruins of places like the baths of Caracalla. And of course, the landscape around Rome as well was the inspiration for much Romantic painting. This is a painting by Claude Lorrain. And you will be familiar, I'm sure, with not only his work, but the work of all of the artists, American and British, and all over Europe that came after him. That's, as I say, very much inspired by by ruins and by a kind of idea of a glorified past. And I'm often dealing with buildings that are both romantic and classical. This is a house that I worked on a few years ago. It's called Kilmerston Manor, and it's in Hampshire, near where I live, in Winchester. And it's a medieval house built in the 15th century as a whole house, timber framed, and then was added to in the 15th and 16th centuries. It was very comprehensively remodeled in the early 18th century and given the appearance of a classical house. But it stands in very lovely Hampshire countryside, and it's definitely haunted, and it's yes, to me, a sort of embodiment of both Romanticism and Classicism. And when we restored the house, we tried to put it back as faithfully as possible back into how it might have been, but actually never was. So this door case is in fact completely new, but because the house had been remodelled in about 1720, which is round about the time that James Gibbs was writing his book on architecture, all of the details for the front door are taken straight from Gibbs, as if a provincial craftsman had picked up a copy of this book and just followed it as accurately as they could. And I think that sometimes in architecture that's really a good thing to do, is to sort of put your own will on hold, to sort of suppress your own will, and to just allow yourself to be guided by this, the romantic spirit. And at the back of that house, we built a new dining room. This is it, which is rather in a sort of early 19th century mode that might have been done by Soane or one of his contemporaries, and is top lit, you can see, with a pendentive dome and coloured glass to bring a sort of warmth of light that the English climate wouldn't normally bring. into this new room. So I am going to be talking a bit about my work. I want to also talk about taste, because thinking about the early 19th century, it was a very extraordinary time when, if you were to peer into a drawing room of a country house, you would find ladies having tea, dressed in Grecian outfits, sitting on Greek-inspired furniture, surrounded by a room decorated with Greek-inspired decoration. And it was a world of incredible consistency in design. Everything seemed to have the same root. And when you compare it with our life today, life is so much more complicated, and it would be impossible to live with this sort of level of consistency. So this is actually my house, and I live with a sort of combination of modernity and tradition, which I think is very common to all of us. It's okay to wear a jacket with buttons on the sleeves that is based on a frock coat that people were wearing in the 19th century, but at the same time having a phone in your pocket, which is a completely new technology, or driving a car, which has nothing to do with the design of your clothes or possibly of the buildings that we're in. And really what I feel is that the level of consistency that was experienced in the past is just inconceivable now, unless, I suppose, you could live in a house which was completely modern in all respects. But that would be pretty joyless, and I certainly can't imagine myself living in that kind of environment. So I think that we are in a world of incredible diversity and difference, and that is something that we should celebrate. And maybe thinking of the world as being a combination of the classical and the romantic is a good way of looking at it. So I want to say a little bit about the orders, and I think that you've all learned about the orders. You all know more about the orders at this point than most qualified architects do. But this, as you will know, is a plate from Serlio's book, published in the mid-16th century, and is the first time that the 5 orders, as we now regularly represent them, but the first time that they were arranged in this group of the Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian composite. Of course, his proportions are a bit unusual, and we now look at the Ionic particularly and think it looks rather odd. But this family of 5 is what we have inherited from Serlio. At around the same time in England, only a few years later, after Serlio's book and before Palladio's book, there was an English architect called John Shute, who published a treatise on architecture. And this is a plate, this one you may not be so familiar with, but when he represented the orders, he represented them alongside gods. And so for him, the Doric order was like the more military and strong gods like Mars and Atlas, and the Ionic for the more matronly gods. And of course that as a metaphor is something that runs right through treatises, that we have the Doric described as the more masculine order, the Ionic as the matronly, the Corinthian as being the proportions of a young maiden, and so on. And we're all familiar with them, but it is easy sometimes to forget it when we're always looking at the orders just as columns. Also from Serlio's treatise were all his amazing stage sets, and some of those are in cities, and then there's a stage set which is in a sort of bucolic, rustic setting, which feels perhaps more Tuscan in character. And so the orders as metaphors are something that I think possibly began to get lost in the late 16th century. And I think that Palladio may be partly responsible for that. Palladio's book is so much like a kind of textbook of something highly technical. And he doesn't say anything about the meaning of the orders at all. When he first introduces them, he just says the Doric is the thickest, so you should put that at the bottom, and then put the Ionic on top of that, because that's the next thickest, and so on. And there's absolutely no mention of what the orders mean or represent. And in the 20th century, Palladio went through a whole sort of revival when a lot of writers settled on him as being, I suppose, the most abstract of the classicists, and started looking at his villas, comparing them to Le Corbusier's villas, and reducing them to a kind of these sort of abstract figures. Of course, one can do that with Palladio. You could do it with anybody's work, but I think what you miss then is all of the meaning and allegory and romance that does sit behind the orders. And that started to be reclaimed in Britain, at any rate, between the wars. After the terrible destruction and loss of the First World War, a whole group of artists in Britain and poets started re-looking at classicism, but from a romantic point of view. This is a painting by John Piper from the early 1930s of John Vanbragh's Seton Delaval Hall, which many of you will know of the sort of English Baroque period. But this kind of painting of looking at classicism as something much more atmospheric, I think, could be an interesting way for classicism to continue to reinvent itself. So, next thing I want to talk about is measuring, because I've taken measuring quite seriously. I found that when I was studying architecture, I, unlike you, didn't really get any schooling in the language of classicism, and really had to teach myself. And I found the best way of doing that was just taking a sketchbook and a tape measure and a scale rule and finding things that I liked and just drawing them to scale in the sketchbook. So I have done quite a lot of that. This is me measuring in Sicily a few years ago. It's become a really sort of, when you describe it to other people, they think that I might be slightly mad. Also, if you pull out a tape measure in a museum, then all the security guards get really suspicious and think that maybe this is some kind of new terrorist activity. But the architects of the past were always measuring and publishing their measured drawings. And to me, it's absolutely second nature that classical architects ought to study and draw in that way. And it's a really good way of advancing the sort of sophistication of your designs more quickly than just trying to invent things on a blank sheet of paper. So I find you always learn new things. I'm just going to show you a few pages from sketchbooks. I don't know how well these are coming out on the screen, but these, sometimes I'm measuring buildings that I've stayed in. So this is a house in Somerset in the south of England, which is owned by the National Trust, and you can rent it for holidays. And while I was there, I measured the plans of the house, which are on the right-hand side, and then the facade as well, which is on the left. And these are drawn to scale into the book all in one go. So sometimes people will take measurements or something, do a little sketch, and then go back to their room and think, okay, I'm going to draw it up properly later. And I found years ago that if I thought that that was going to happen, it never did. And there's always something better to do than to sit down and draw up a measured drawing that you didn't finish earlier. So I try and do as much as, well, I do everything on site. These are some balustrades and a detail of a funerary monument in a church in Lincolnshire. And the one on the left is by Carlo Fontana, the Roman Baroque architect, and the one on the right is by Grimling Gibbons, who was an English Baroque he sort of sculptor, specialised in working in timber. But the profiles are very similar to one another. You know, different architect, different country, different period, but you begin to find this sort of common language of mouldings the more that you measure. Often it's decoration, so this is from the Erechtheion in Athens now in the British Museum, a little fragment of the beautiful frieze decoration of these alternating Anthemian and Parmet patterns. And then you can see just drawn along the top a section through them. And I always find drawing sections through decorative ornament really, really helpful when you come to actually design it. These are staircase balustrades. Quite a lot of the things that I've measured you'll see are sort of easy height to get at with a tape measure, because people often say, how do you measure a whole building if you don't have a scaffold or a ladder? And I admit it can be quite difficult. So things that are easily at eye level are obviously more accessible. These are wrought iron staircase balustrades from a collection in Surrey, near London. And this is in Bologna, where I think you might have been recently. Did you go to the Anatomical Theatre in Bologna University? But it was the most amazing theatre where it was one of the early places where they did dissections, exactly, human dissections. And there's a marble slab in the middle of this beautiful wooden theatre. And there's a balustrade around it made in timber. And when you come to design balustrades, staircases and things like that, you will find that there's a very annoying regulation that means that you have to design all balustrades in such a way that a baby's head can't get wedged in the balustrade of a staircase. And it's a 4-inch or 100mm sphere, cannot pass through the balustrade. So whenever I see a balustrade that does comply with that, I have to measure it because it's very useful. So this is turned timber. This is a box sash window in typical English box sash window. So the bottom left is the sliding sash, it goes up and down, and then the rest of it is the folded shutters which go away into the interior. You don't really get that detail in Rome, the shutters tend to be external, but in England everything is sort of inside out because it's all about trying to keep the rain out, and you get these deep reveals with folded shutters. This is in Berlin. This is designed by Schinkel and done in cast iron at the Altus Museum. And then on these are both from Rome. On the left is a detail from the Arab Arches, which I imagine you've been to go and look at in the Arab Arches Museum. And that was done in about half a day. It would have been nice to have a bit longer to spend on it, but in scroll enrichment does take a long time to draw. And the one on the right is in the Tabularium in the Capitoline Museum, in that amazing sort of loggia that overlooks the Forum. And this actually isn't measured, this is just drawn by eye. But I've found that years of measuring has sort of trained my eye quite well to draw things freehand, but I do prefer to just verify things with tape measure if I can. This is in New York. If any of you have been to the Greek and Roman galleries in the Met, there's an enormous Capitol there, which is about 15 foot across, from the Temple of Artemis in Sardis. And it's an amazing Capitol, but it's so large that all the sort of enrichments have sub-enrichments. So there's the egg and dart here. Each egg has its own little Anthemian, and then each leaf of the Anthemian is also carved. It's an amazing lesson in scale that, when you look in the books, it's presented without any scale, as if an Ionic capital is going to be the same whether it's this big or that big. But actually, in reality, all of the enrichments get adapted to the scale the thing is at. This is in a house in Devon. This is all made out of different timbers. It's a quarter landing on a staircase and made out of different timbers. So in the middle here, this is yew and holly and sycamore and oak and walnut around here, with the grain of the wood used as a sort of form of decoration. So you can see that a lot of these are in different materials, and I find that measuring, sometimes it's about geometry, but it's also, as you're measuring, you've got your hands in contact with different materials all of the time, and you sort of, there's a physicality to it, which is actually quite different from just sitting passively drawing, or even more so, taking photographs. This is in San Clemente, which is very near here. These are some of the Cosmatesque floors from the 12th century in the upper part of the church there. And ultimately, all of these sort of interesting geometric patterns come from further east. And these are in Istanbul, very sophisticated tile patterns of the 15th and 16th centuries, using a standard shape of tile, but building up these very complex patterns. And these are in India, in New Delhi, and they're made in pierced stonework, and the sort of section of the stone is actually much thinner than you would imagine you would do in stone, so that's a section through the stone, about 3/4 of an inch thick. And then sometimes I measure things which aren't really architecture but have an architectural quality. This is a full-size drawing of a clarinet, and in its box. And then this is a gateway in Bath by one of John Soane's pupils, who's called Edward Davis. And on the left is just an ordinary door case in which by a completely unrecorded architect, but just very beautiful late 18th century door case. And on the right is a bit of decoration that's now in the Met in New York by Louis Sullivan. So that's measure drawings. And for me, measure drawings are the kind of foundation of what I do, because they have trained my eye, given me an understanding of materials, of a sort of language of mouldings, geometry, all sorts of things. And some of you might take this up more seriously, and it's not by any means essential. I think that everybody has a kind of crutch that they like to lean on, and for me it's measure drawings is a really, really useful thing, but for others it will be proportioning systems, or there are any number of devices that get you over the line. But I thought I would show you some examples of work, and in some cases there are obvious links back to measure drawings. When we're doing country housework, it always helps to be in a place that has quite a mature landscape around it. So this was a new wing on the end of an old house, but at the end of a long drive with beautiful old beech trees all the way down it. And building in the country is a challenge, because buildings actually need to weather in and soften and be surrounded by beautiful gardens and so on. And this photograph was taken about a year after the house was finished, and they planted a kind of instant garden, which was amazing. But and this project was finished about 5 or 6 years ago, and I always feel that as classical architects, what we should really be doing is showing photographs of our work about 20 years after it was finished, because they improve with age. And this is such a different thing to so much contemporary architecture, which is the architects only really mind about the photographs that are taken the day it's finished. And maybe this is all part of where I started talking about Romanticism, is a proper understanding amongst architects of how our buildings change over time. But anyway, I can't fast forward and show you pictures of things in 20 years' time, but this is a new summer house that was designed in brick because it was next to a historic house that was all brick. And you can see it's a sort of Tuscan or Doric building with the order all adapted for the use of brick. And this is a close-up. So I know the projects you're doing here are all much more literal than this, but I do like playing with the orders. And for instance, instead of having gutty hanging off the bottom of a triglyph, just to slice a brick long ways in half to sort of take the place of where those gutty would have been. So this is a very rustic kind of classicism. So there are now some new country houses which I'll show you. This is on the site of a redundant dairy farm in Wiltshire, and it just had a whole lot of big modern barns on it, and the owners were very passionate about Italian culture and wanted to build a little Palladian house. I love the idea that clients they bring the order to you. So this husband and wife were both very Doric in character, and other clients of mine have been one has been Doric and the other Ionic or whatever. But I think that the orders do have very human characteristics, and so everything about this house is extremely Doric. And these are two drawings, one at the front of the house and one at the back. They're sort of bay studies, a bit like the ones that some of you have been doing recently. These are drawn in dip pen in sepia ink, all with dots and hatching. It's a very slow and labour-intensive way of drawing. I think you mostly do watercolours, which I would definitely recommend as being better. But they do, at the end of it, have the sort of quality a bit like copper engravings or steel engravings from some of the treatises that you've been looking at. And lettering is something that I always try and take time over. In fact, I often find that lettering on drawings takes as long as the drawing itself, even though it occupies only a small area. And that's something that we might look at tomorrow when we're doing some measure drawing. Somebody years ago said to me that a bad drawing can be infinitely improved with good lettering, and a good drawing can be immediately ruined with bad lettering. And it's always made me sort of think that you can lift, or a drawing can sort of rise or fall substantially with good or bad lettering. So this is the house built. This is the entrance front, which faces west and has a sort of arcaded loggia. And then on the side of the house there is an oak pergola which goes along the side of the garden. And then this is the back with an enormous lawn where they can play croquet. And this is a detail of that front. And it's a Doric order taken straight out of Palladio. So, I've been sort of slightly disparaging about Palladio earlier, but Palladio's orders are really hard to improve on. And this is taken almost straight from the book. The archivolt, slightly simplified, and no decoration in the metapiece, but other than that, pretty much straight from the book. And that's another view of it, with the garden starting to grow up around it. And then inside the front hall is a sort of neither indoor nor outdoor space where they have put huge pots and are growing ferns. And then this is the hall dining room in the middle of the house, which is a bit like in Venetian palaces, where you get a long room that goes right through the palace. If you were in Venice recently, you may have seen some of them, but it's a very particular type where you get a long room spanning from front to back. And I think that these make really good dining rooms, because if you make a dining room now, people live so much less formally than they used to, and they just never use a dining room. So most of the houses I've done, the hall is also the dining room. And this is looking the other way. The staircase all in stone, and there's an arch going through to it, all lined in stone. So it's quite an unusual house, much more architectural than we would normally do. And it has fireplaces in it which are based on the fireplaces in Palladio's Villa Barbaro at Marseille, and then we also commissioned some sculptural panels for the dining room, which are based on local birds and trees and flowers. And this is the drawing room, which is a rather intense shade of custard yellow gloss and very strong colours. So that's the first house. This is the second one. This is another little Palladian house on the site of a farm in Hampshire, and it had a house on it here which was rather tired, but it had some nice old brick farm buildings next to it. And this is the plan of it. It's very closely based on one of Palladio's villas, which is the Villa Ragona, which is in the Quattro Libri. And in fact, I think I've got a slide here comparing the Villa Ragona with the plan of Hayes. And some of you would have been adjusting to using meters instead of feet. And because I work in England, everything we do has to be dimensioned in meters, but I do very much think in feet. And in England, in the 18th century, a lot of architects took the Quattro Libri very literally and built things according to the numbers that were given in the Quattro Libri. But Palladio's feet in Vicenza and Venice in the 16th century were quite a bit bigger than the English or American foot that we use now. So it was about 14 inches compared to the 12-inch foot that we would have now. So there's a sort of generosity of scale to Palladio's unit of measurement that you don't get if you use English or American feet. So, so this whole house was designed in Venetian feet using Palladio's measurements. So the 12 here is not 12 English feet, it's 12 Venetian feet, which is 14, what we would recognise as that's 14 feet by 17'6", which just gives the house a little bit, it's a sort of a sixth more generous than you're expecting it to be. And it was I suppose, a kind of academic exercise in trying to follow Palladio as literally as possible. But it does give the house this more generous scale. And this is a drawing of the main front, and this is a photograph of it. So it's an Ionic porch, very Ionic clients in this case, but otherwise, very, very sort of straight Palladio, and a view right through the house. So although it's a square house, you can see right through from front to back. And this is looking at the side of the house, so that it's got these buildings alongside which house garages, and there's a little staff cottage, and all of the boiler rooms and everything are housed in a bit like one of Palladio's barquesas or cart lodges. And that's another view of the garages. And you see the Tuscan columns here with no base, just going straight into the floor. And this is the front door. So this is, although the clients were very Ionic, they were very young, had very young children, and I had the thought that in maybe 10 or 20 years' time, they might become more Corinthian people. And so the Ionics on the front door are sort of, they are Ionic, but they've got leaves beginning to grow in the neck of the capital that are one day going to sort of become something more like a composite capital. And I really love the idea that that people can be expressed through the orders. And then this is for the staff cottage, and here these Tuscan columns straight into the floor. And inside, it's a very sort of traditional English country house. In fact, it's so old-fashioned that most people visiting the house imagine it's been there for a long time and needs redecorating, because it sort of always feels quite dated in its taste, but it's brand new. Hand-painted Chinese blue wallpaper in the dining room, and the stairs in the middle of the house. You could just see. And so this is a staircase upstairs, all of the landings top lit with sort of Sonian domes, and there's this balustrade that runs around the middle here. And I don't know if you remember earlier, I was showing you a drawing of the frieze decoration from the Eric Feehan in the British Museum, from the full-size thing of the Parmet patterns. So I'd taken one of those, full-size, and replicated it exactly, and thought this could be made in cast iron for the balustrade of the stairs. So that's what these are here. And the clients, when they saw it, said that it reminded them of an engraving that they had on their wall of two monkeys playing. It was, one monkey was sort of hanging off the tail of the other monkey, and they said, could we remove one of these and put a little monkey in there instead? And I thought it sounded like pretty much the worst idea I'd ever heard. And so I kind of said, yeah, okay, whatever. And then next time I saw them, they said, George, have you done anything about the monkey yet? And the more I hoped that it would go away, the more they kept reminding me. So in the end, I did a little drawing of this monkey, and then a friend of mine who's a sculptor cast it in bronze, and here it is, with its tail wrapping around here. And when the house was finished, everybody who visits the house, it's the first thing they see, and it's become like the sort of the mascot of the house. And I've given a talk like this quite a few times before in different places, and years later people say, oh yeah, I remember you gave that talk, and I remember the little monkey, and I promise you it's the only thing that anybody ever remembers. But it does make me think that what I thought was a really bad idea, because it seemed very unclassical, is in fact very charming, and evokes all sorts of memories in people's minds. You know, they're young children who have brought up in this house. It's going to be a very sort of strong memory in theirs and their friends' minds for their lifetime. And maybe in architecture we need more things like this. So, so now I try and get as much sculpture into buildings as possible, because I just think that it's something that brings joy to people's lives. This is another house where there was a rather hideous bungalow here, and we got permission to knock it down and replace it with a villa. And this has quite, I want to show you plans of houses because I'm fascinated with the way that plans work. And this is designed around 3 rooms which are all the same size. So there's a hall dining room, there's a living room, and there's a kitchen. And that's really the sort of basis of many people's lives, is a sort of a hard and a soft room for living in, and then somewhere for entertaining. And so all of these rooms are 18 by 24 feet. And it's such a good size for a sort of a room that needs to be quite flexible. And then this is upstairs, so there are bedrooms in the 4 corners, and then there's a long gallery that runs through the middle of the house upstairs. And I should say that one of the nice things about these 2 rooms is that they're connected across this hallway by sliding doors, so that you can open the whole house up and make the rooms into one. This is a photograph of it. For me, I think this is sort of, it's like moving on beyond Palladio. This is not really a Palladian house at all. It's more like the kind of picturesque houses that you get by people like Nash in Anson in the early 19th century, a pale-coloured brick rather than a red brick, and a more asymmetrical plan. And I suppose that picturesque tradition is linked with this more romantic view, particularly a closer engagement with nature and with landscape setting. That's the front of the house, and then this is the back of it. Again, it's surrounded by beech trees, and there's a walled garden to this side, which is built in brick and flint. Flint, which is a rather unusual material, very, very hard-wearing stone with a shiny surface. And then this is inside. So it has a slightly more modern feel than some of the other houses. And this is looking from the living room through to the kitchen with the sliding doors all open. And that's the kitchen. And it sort of has the character of a room that is quite an old room that has been refitted as a kitchen, which I think is quite a good thing. So, street architecture. I think this is a bit different than designing country houses, because ultimately you're putting your best face forward. You know, street architecture is about facades. And I've done quite a lot of work in Poundbury, which is the, are you all familiar with Poundbury? Have you talked about Poundbury? It's commissioned by the Prince of Wales in his role as the Duke of Cornwall. The Duchy of Cornwall, which is the land-owning body that he is head of, had lots of land to the west of a town in Dorset called Dorchester, and about 25 years ago a master plan was drawn up by Leon Creer, and it's been under construction ever since. And I've designed about 200 or 300 houses at Poundbury, about half of which have been built. And mostly they are residential, so there's a bit of mixed use. This building has a restaurant on the ground floor, an arcaded loggia, and then it has a flat above. This is social flats, so these are built for people on low incomes. This is a new street of houses. These are private houses, and then these are affordable ones. And mostly they're very simple. I think the key thing with Poundbury, we've found, is to not be over-ambitious. And of course, architects, once they've been through a long training, they know everything about the orders and how to use them, is that they want to put everything on the building. And actually, this is really an exercise in restraint and just trying to do simple things as well as possible. So these are social rented houses, very cheap to construct, and just spending money where it counts. And the money in this case is just on decent windows and slate for the roof. But other than that, they're built in concrete block, plastered and painted. So it is, I think, a lesson that classicism can be built on a low budget. And of course, people often criticize it for being an elitist style that's expensive. These are slightly more expensive, but not much. Private houses, a terrace of 6, and just very simple rusticated ground floor with a giant order above. But the giant order is little more than a sort of an inch of render with a capital and a base, which is completely repetitive, so can be cast from a mould. And these are some other buildings in Poundbury. This is commercial units on the ground floor, and then flats above with a deep balcony, and then more flats upstairs. That's the restaurant with an apartment above. And these are some. There's an apartment building that we designed to look a bit like a converted factory or light industrial building in 3 different colours of brick. So you get the sort of browny brick, the pale one, and then the blue ones around the windows. Then this is a private house on the left here, and social flats and social rented flats, houses rather, there. So it is a genuine mix of different things. It's for anybody who hasn't been to Poundbury, I would really encourage you to go. There are good and bad things about it. It is very experimental, but it's one of the very few places that has successfully introduced mixed use into a completely new development. And it has about a third of all of the properties built are affordable, and it has as many workspaces as it has places for people to live. So there are about 1,500 people living in Poundbury, and there are about 1,500 jobs as well. So it's very remarkable. So there, this is a building in London for a firm of art dealers called Richard Green. And this was the site here. So the building is these two buildings in the middle of the screen. And the architecture of Bond Street is very mixed. There's a bit of everything really of different periods. And this was a drawing on the left and then a more finished presentation drawing on the right of the design. And this has sculpture going right across the facade by a neoclassical sculptor called Alexander Stoddart, who's a friend of mine, and all based on scenes from the Odyssey, and done in bas relief. And this was the building when it was under construction, so the scaffolding had just come down. And I think maybe it was quite unusual to see a brand new neoclassical building in the middle of London. Everybody walking past it assumed that it was an old building that had just been cleaned, which I thought was a really good sign. And actually, it looked a bit newer once it had its windows fitted. So there it is, and that's it, taken after it just been finished. And I think that it's fitted in very well to the streetscape in such a way that you wouldn't necessarily know it was a new building. But it uses a more sort of abstracted version of the orders than the ones that you find in the books. And with its sculpture, it has a sort of neo-Greek quality to it. But actually, if you really thought about it, I don't think it could have been built at any time other than in 2010, which is when it was built. And inside, it's got a very simple cantilevered stone staircase. And this is a drawing of part of the frieze that I did. So then, last project I'm going to show you is in New Delhi, in India, and is slightly different because it's sort of not on home turf for me. Although, of course, New Delhi was built by British architects, a lot of it designed by Lutyens and Baker. But elsewhere in Delhi, there are amazing historic monuments going much, much further back in time. And so this was a sort of a combination of Greek-inspired neoclassicism with some older Indian traditions thrown in. Of course, it's all made in local materials. And I thought I would just show you some pictures from the building site, because it's so unlike what building sites are. Like normally it's people walking around in safety kit, and it's an awful lot of steel and an awful lot of concrete everywhere. And this house was completely traditionally built in load-bearing masonry, solid brick walls, and all of the stonework is sort of massively thick pieces. And absolutely no health and safety on site whatsoever, which was pretty scary at times. And, you know, I think that we tend to think that because we do something traditional, that we're on the side of the angels when it comes to sustainability. And I see new buildings being built, and I think that actually all new buildings, whether they're classical or not, are quite wasteful in their materials. And meanwhile, all of the people who were working on the building site had built themselves temporary little houses to live in around the edge of the building site, just out of tin and using fallen branches to stop the tin blowing off the roof, and washing the sacks that the cement had come in, and using them as a doormat and everything. And it was an amazing lesson in sort of human ingenuity, and actually seeing whole families living on this building site in very unsafe conditions. But maybe much more of a lesson in sustainability than the house itself, which I had thought was highly sustainable because we were building it all in solid load-bearing masonry. Anyway, and this is the house finished. And it does have a very solid look to it. But it is ultimately a big house for a wealthy family. And once all of the people have left the site, all of the sort of inequalities that you find in Indian society, you know, are still around. But it was an amazing project to do, and really properly traditionally built. So I'm just going to conclude by saying something quickly about the orders. I wrote a book a few years ago called A Treatise on Modern Architecture, because I wanted to say that what we do is modern, and I think it's important that we reclaim the word modern, because it is, modern doesn't have to mean modernist. And in it, I just considered how we might think about the 5 orders. And so going back to what I was saying right at the beginning about Serlio and his family of 5, this is how we conventionally think of the orders. And I think that there are maybe alternative ways, you know, ways that might convey the allegories and mystery that lie behind these 5 columns. The fact that we know that the Doric is the more military and foursquare and masculine, that the Ionic is more curvy and generous and friendly, and that the Tuscan is bucolic and rustic. How can we express that? And this is my version of how that might be done, which is to illustrate the orders not as columns but as places. And so this is what called, as you could see, the classical landscape. And just to run you through it very quickly, well, you can see really that the Tuscan is a farm and is close to the source of the river. The Doric is a fort, originally built in timber and then rebuilt in stone, because, you know, we know that all of the details of the Doric order, it's all about timber construction remade in stone. The Ionic is like a garden city, full of crescents and circuses, and with no wall around it, but surrounded by earthworks. So it's much more sort of open-sided, with these sort of skirts around it. The Corinthian is like a citadel, with a fortified wall around it. Siena, I suppose, is the ultimate Corinthian city, and much more densely packed. And then the composite is a port, which is half Corinthian, that's the citadel at its core, and half Ionic, which is the sort of suburbs surrounding it. So I think that this carries with it some of the stories that are told about the orders, the fact that the composite is half Corinthian and half Ionic. But it also opens up all this interesting kind of new territory for further exploration, for orders that might lie somewhere outside the conventional towns. And just to illustrate that, this is from the new house that I was saying is straight out of Palladio. So if you had to sort of situate that on the map, it would be right in the middle of there. So that's fine. That's conventional Doric. But what about this? This is sort of like half Doric, half Tuscan. So we've now got somewhere to put it in between the two. This again is kind of half Doric, half Tuscan. It's got triglyphs, but the triglyphs haven't been cut. Scamozzi actually shows a Tuscan order very like this, but without any gutty underneath it. So it just gives us room to experiment. Again, this is a garden temple with an uncut triglyph. It feels perhaps more Tuscan in character. This is the front door of the couple who were Ionic, but are one day going to grow up to be Corinthian. So they've got, you know, there's all this new territory. And then in the conventional 5 orders, where would you put this, right? Because this, you see this kind of stuff everywhere, but there's no conventional way of describing it. This is the shop front from the same building. very difficult to say whether this is Doric or Ionic or what, but it's definitely classical. Or this is the outside of a library that we did. I mean, it sort of feels a little bit Ionic here, and it's got a kind of wavy frieze, all of the mouldings are classical, but what is it? And then lastly, this is the house in Delhi, which for the real train spotters amongst you, you will know that this is a straight Greek Ionic from the Erechtheion, but because it doesn't have columns, it only has pilasters, you never see the famous Erechtheion rounded volutes of the column capital. So that's an Ionic, a Greek Ionic pilaster cap. So anyway, this is all in the interests of hopefully broadening your horizons about what the orders are and could be, and hopefully thinking of the orders as something that are both classical and romantic might be an interesting insight. So thank you all very much for this time.
I'm sure George would be happy to take questions, so I'd like to refer first to the students and the faculty here as well. Please.
If I could ask, what order do you think you are?
I'm sort of quite a Doric version of an Ionic. An interesting thing is that the Doric and the Ionic are seen, they're the sort of, the Doric and the Ionic are essentially the two core orders in Greek antiquity. So they're always seen as in opposition to one another. But in Roman architecture, if you draw a section through a Doric capital and you draw a section through the middle of an Ionic capital, they're virtually identical. The only difference is that the Echinus has just moved out. So in Roman architecture, it feels like an Ionic is simply a Doric that has grown curves. And I love the Ionic order when it has dentils added to it, and sort of feels semi-Doric. So I suppose I'm quite a masculine Ionic, is the answer.
Yeah. Something I find very compelling about the various works of architecture that you've designed that you've shown us are the way the shadows add. Something I found quite compelling about the architecture that you've shown us is the way that the shadows contribute so greatly to the composition.
Yes.
How do you work in the shadows during the design process? If so, and what is your process regarding?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because the orders have so many things. There's all the meaning, but there's all the way that they shed the weather and the way that they respond to the light as well. And so I try and draw the shadows on as I'm sketching. The shadows appear right at the beginning. But as we got on the screen, this job in India, what I realized with Greek architecture is that the light in Greece is so different to the light in sort of further north in Europe, and certainly in British light it's totally different. The sun is much higher overhead in Greece, and the buildings tend to be surrounded by pavements, and the pavements are made of very shiny marble. And so what happens is in Greek architecture is you get very strong shadows cast from the light overhead, but then you get very strong underlighting from the reflected light coming up from the pavement underneath. And that is totally different to English climate. When things are in shadow, they're in shadow. And these are sort of subtleties that I think you only really start picking up on sort of later on. I mean, nobody ever taught me that. I wish somebody early on had said to me, look at the quality of different qualities of light in different places. And I studied in Edinburgh, and Scottish light is amazing because it's quite far north. And sunshine is more horizontal than vertical for most of the year. And they, through the Scottish Enlightenment, were much more interested in Greek architecture than they were in Roman architecture. And so you get this curious thing of very Greek buildings, but lit horizontally. And so the way that the shadows fall on them is totally different. I must say, I normally render things so that's sort of the drawing convention that goes through 45 degrees. I'm always thinking about it, but there's no doubt that when things are built, you're always slightly surprised at how things work. And of course, depending on orientation as well, because northerly orientation it will only get sun at the very beginning and end of the day. But yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about right from the beginning. Yeah.
When you're talking about how a building ages, do you think that it just naturally happens if you're following the classical order, or are there some considerations you have to take to make sure that it matures properly?
I think if you're, weathering details are built into the classical language, so that a cornice will have a drip on it that sheds the water. But there are all sorts of decisions you still need to make about whether you're going to cover the top of the cornice with metal sheet, or whether you're going to allow the moisture to track through the joints, because that's a very different look 20 years down the line. And but that's the kind of thing that's quite hard to learn in a studio environment. It's the sort of thing that you will pick up in offices, and then ultimately you will only pick up by detailing buildings and then seeing them later on and thinking, yeah, I see how that's weathering now. I'm only starting to see it because I've been in practice, I've been designing stuff for 15 years, and it's only that kind of length of time that you really get to see buildings perform properly. But I would love to do a book in 20, 30 years' time of all of these projects, and because I just think that it's outside the discourse now. People are not really talking about how buildings change and what an important part of classical architecture that is. Yeah.
You showed us two different examples of works that you've done, some that are more like liberal and free and like more abstract in their design, while others are very much more like orthodox and taken straight from treatises and things like that. Is there a specific process by which you make these decisions, or do you kind of arbitrarily decide that, oh, this project feels more liberal, I want to do this more abstract?
It's the latter. I mean, it's not completely arbitrary. It's normally just a question of judgment. The project that was in London for the firm of art dealers, it was a building for modern pictures. And I thought, there's no way that we could do an 18th century treatment on the front of this building. It would just be completely anachronistic. But sometimes there is actually feels stronger to do something absolutely literal. So I think it's just personal judgment, really. I'm not really naturally a risk taker. So there's always a tendency to sort of play it safe. And then part of my brain is always saying, don't do the same thing twice. It's just not interesting. Keep, trying new things. And sometimes they don't work out. But then you will never find out unless you try different things. So yeah, it's definitely is two sides working against one another. But I years ago worked for an architect who liked doing the same thing over and over again, and to a point where everything was perfected, to an extraordinary level of detail. And he was much happier doing that. And I think it would just drive me a bit mad. Yeah, I think it's sort of, I guess, down to personal choice. There isn't a right or wrong. And classicism has the capacity to be different for all of you. You know, it's all about a kind of expressing yourself. And this is one of the fascinating things, is that it's been excluded from so much architectural education because it's said to lack creativity. And to me, it's the exact opposite.
I was wondering, at what point in the design process for you, especially in the design of like a Palladian villa, for example, how does the order that's been chosen to be used, the classical order, how does that, and at what point does that influence the design, especially in like the plan of design rather than just the detail scale? How does the order influence and affect the more architectural style, and how early on has that become an influencer in design?
I think, I mean, that I sort of, normally on houses there are two sets of orders going on. There's the big one that controls the entire body of the building, and then there are smaller ones that might be around door openings, or they might be in individual rooms. So the big one has to be set really early on, but the small ones can be much more adaptive. And the small ones can be different, you know, so you could get a room which is completely Corinthian next to a room that's completely Doric. And that's one of the beauties of rooms of different characters. But the overall house has to know what it is early on. But that's not to say that there are plan forms that feel particularly Doric or Ionic to me. Maybe that would be an interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, the orders as places would suggest that different plan forms would be more or less suited to different orders. But the orders as places is just me trying to rationalise it in my mind. So it may not make sense to you, or it may do. And I think this is the thing that you can, if it's useful, then make use of it. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Yeah. I mean, I sort of, right from the moment that I meet the clients, there's already even before I've seen a site or anything, there's a sort of a strong order-based character forming in your mind.
That's what I was wondering. Is
Yeah.
when you meet a client that you think is distinctly associated with one's
Yeah,
order,
always.
how does that influence the design process, basically, from the larger scale?
Yeah, no, I want it to come from them. So there's a nice thing about working with private clients, is that you feel like you've just become a conduit for them being expressed as a building. Yeah.
I have to admit, I haven't read your treatise yet. I will. But I can't help but notice that in the lineage of maybe Vitruvius and Serlio and Palladio and so on, yours is the first to call itself a treatise on modern architecture. Can I ask why? Why did you choose to call it modern architecture?
Well, the sort of modern is a word that starts getting used in the 18th century. I just feel that in England, there are a few classical architects, and they haven't really made many inroads into the profession. Basically there are a few people doing country houses, but almost all architects are doing really bland modernist architecture, and all the education system is completely set that way. So we're very much the exception. And I think that we haven't really helped ourselves by being quite reactionary in our in the way that we engage with the modern world. You know, a lot of classical architects who won't use computers, and they won't carry a mobile phone, and they won't send you an email, and you know, and they're sort of, it's like they're trying to live in a different time and place. And so I feel it's really important that we talk about classicism as a modern phenomenon, and because I just feel it has so much to offer without having to retreat into the past. So that's why I did it. But I think also the appearance of the book is extremely old-fashioned. When it was, I mean, it other than the fact that it's got photographs in it, it looks like a reprint of a book that was published in about 1830. And very deliberately, like, I went through a lot of books published then and chose the exact same typography and everything. And it was listed on Amazon, and and I looked it up one day, and it said publication date, facsimile, original publication date, 1832. I don't know where they got that from, but somebody at Amazon must have looked at it and said, this is an old book. So I was quite, I thought that was good. Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, I like playing with sort of slightly going under the radar and doing things that are a little bit unexpected, because then you shape people, particularly if you start using their language. Yeah, and the word modern is quite a good one.
I think maybe we should, unless you want to go one more question. We'll have one more question. I think we need to give.
That's fine, yeah.
A long day.
They're good questions. Good questions.
You have all day with you tomorrow as well.
I know that your exhibition in London is called Measure, Draw, Build. Is that kind of how you go about your design process?
Yeah, I didn't want it to be called anything classical, because I want it to be about, and I think that makes it a bit more palatable for other architects, because it's not seen as being critical of what they do. It's just and there's a catalogue here. This is a Selena's copy, but you're welcome to have a look at it. Yeah, so I went to the RIBA, which is like the AIA in America, and said, can I do an exhibition here? And they said, what's it about? And I said, it's about my design process. And they said, yeah, that sounds really interesting. Yeah, please do that. And then sort of slightly under the radar, like putting up massive pictures of classical buildings. And I think that they were, I mean, it wasn't enough to stop it, but I think that it wasn't quite what they were expecting. And it's good, because it's got people in London sort of questioning, you know, why does so much modern architecture look so boring, and what happened to classicism, and you know, maybe we should reevaluate where we are. So yeah, but for me, it is a process. Measuring is my hobby, and drawing is central to it, so that comes in the middle. You know, in Italian, disegno is design, and drawing is like the same word, isn't it? That is right, isn't it? Yeah. I don't really build models. Everything is just draw. And when I was here last year, I said to somebody, I think I said pretty much at exactly the same time I'm standing here now, I said that if it gets to the end of the day and I haven't drawn something, I feel like the day's been wasted. It's literally, I have to draw something, because that's what it's all about. And so that means that I generate a lot of drawings, some of which are quite bad. But there are enough good ones that they can then, you know, make an exhibition. But also to call them sketchbooks is slightly you know, I don't really carry around a book of ideas and sketch. Those just tend to be on slips of paper that get thrown away. The sketchbook is in fact full of very careful measured drawings that have taken quite a long time to do. So they're not really sketches. And then build, I think, is important because anybody can do drawings. It's getting stuff built. That's the really hard bit. Finding clients who actually pay for this, finding good builders, getting planning permission. You know, that's actually the really, really hard bit. So, yeah, that's how I came back.
Thank you.
Oh yeah.